All right, good afternoon or good morning. My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Welcome everyone to the first part in Network 2020's mini-series about migration to the United States. Before we begin, just as some background for those who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020, we are an independent nonprofit, and we're focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the international affairs community. So we really try to provide a platform for nuanced conversation about global affairs topics that are shaping our world. So you can find more about the programs that we do both online. We also do in-person programs in New York. And you can find that at network2020.org. So just as a brief introduction for today, before I introduce the speakers, undocumented migration from the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, to the United States has been steadily increasing over the past few decades. In 2023, just over half of the migration at the US southern border was from those three countries. Today, in the first part of Network 2020's mini-series on migration to the United States, we really want to look at the root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle and explore what solutions exist to change the decision-making calculus of those who are choosing to make a very dangerous journey. The next event in this mini-series will take place on February 1st at noon. We will speak with Camille Varlock, Chief of Staff to New York City Mayor Eric Adams. We'll also speak with migration historian Nancy Foner and Musafer Chishti, who is head of the Migration Policy Institute in New York, to look at New York City as a case study in receiving migrants, both in this current episode and historically. So we do have that coming up as well. So today, when we look at the root causes, it is my great pleasure to welcome three exceptional leaders in their fields. First, we have Diego de Sola. Diego is the co-founder of Glasswing International, a nonprofit that addresses violence and poverty through education and health programs in Latin America and the Northern Triangle. By day, he works in the private sector, so he can provide great insight into the role the private sector plays. Next, we have Adam Isacson, Director of Defense Oversight at the Washington Office on Latin America, where he monitors U.S. cooperation with Latin America's security forces. He has also been focusing on border security for over 10 years and has been working in the region for decades. And lastly, but not least, we have Professor Elizabeth Oglesby. Elizabeth is Associate Professor of Latin American Studies and Geography at the University of Arizona, where she focuses on state violence, forced displacement, political economy, human rights, and memory. She has been working in the region since the 1980s and brings a wealth of knowledge about the topic. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Elizabeth, I'd like to start with you and your extensive experience in the region. Could you please give us a brief overview of some of the root causes of increased migration from the Northern Triangle? And, especially given your long history working in the region, what have you seen change over time?
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everybody who's listening for your interest. Let me try to make three brief points that could both express the diverse drivers of migration as well as how this has changed over the decades. The first point that we need to understand is that Central American communities are and have been for quite some time fully transnationalized, particularly in the case of Guatemala and El Salvador, where forced displacement in the 1980s sent hundreds of thousands of Central Americans to the United States. And I bring up this history because I think it's important when we think about today's patterns of migration.
We seem to have lost Elizabeth. There she is. Okay, great. we will continue. We'll give her a moment to rejoin, and then we can continue. Wonderful.
Okay, sorry. I guess that's probably a connection at my end. Sorry. So try to be even more brief. And that is the Central Americans who are coming today have these broad connections. They have family connections. They have community ties. So most of them have sponsors. They go to places where they already know people. So I think the level of stress on receiving communities in the United States from Central Americans is perhaps less than with other groups that are more recent and don't have those connections. The second point is to understand how U.S. border policy, beginning in the 1990s, changed the characteristics of Central American migrations towards what we see today. Now, the peace accords in El Salvador and Guatemala did not lead to, it did not decrease migration. In fact, economic migration really rose sharply in the 1990s. Guatemalans particularly were recruited to fill jobs that Mexican workers were leaving in agriculture, in the poultry industry, in meat packing, and so on. But that migration in the 1990s was what migration scholars often call circular migration or shuttle migration, where people, mostly adults, mostly men at that point, would come, particularly in the case of Guatemala, I think, would come work for a while, maybe a year or two, with the goal of returning to their communities and to their families who were staying in Central America. With the US border policy beginning in the mid-1990s and accentuating in the 2000s, that kind of circular migration became difficult and finally impossible, because there's a direct correlation between the border securitization, the walls, the increased enforcement, and the risk and the cost of migrating. Whereas maybe it used to cost $1,000, maybe it costs now $10,000, $12,000, $15,000. And of course, there's growing control by the cartels over the migration routes. It's increasing dangerous. So the point that I want to make is that the border enforcement obviously hasn't stopped Central American migration, but it has changed it so that more and more, beginning in 2014, people began to come with their families, with their children. One, it was the only way really for families to be together because you just couldn't go back and forth, right? And then of course also the coyotes, the people who are bringing migrants, you began to charge actually a different rate. So if you came with your child and you weren't trying to sneak across the border, you were presenting yourself, it would be a lower rate and so on. So the US border policy changed Central American migration in really fundamental ways. And I think it's important to understand. The third point that I want to make has to do with the multiple forms of violence that also are driving people to leave the region. And I think it's important to understand this because a significant amount of the Central American migration may be due to economic reasons, but we cannot discount the violence that is also driving people out. And it's really important, especially now in the current climate, to keep the asylum system, keep the integrity of the asylum system, because there are many, many people who really need that form of relief, for whom being forcibly returned to their country of origin is a matter of life and death. So there are multiple forms of violence that are driving people out of Central America. There may be sort of common street gang violence that affects young people. There's gender-based violence, feminicide. And there also is political violence and political persecution against some sectors in some places, environmental defenders, land defenders, indigenous activists in northern and eastern Guatemala, on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. Also, one of the groups most affected by displacement within Central America and outside of Central America are LGBT people also. So we do see, violence targeting specific sectors in Central America. And finally, you'll notice that I did not mention climate as a major driver. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. But what we're seeing is not a climate exodus. We may see the effects of certain weather events, for example, hurricanes and floods in Honduras, but we are not seeing a climate exodus. We are seeing a policy-related exodus. And if I could just add just an addendum, I know that we're talking about the three northernmost Central American countries, but in Nicaragua, we have seen over the past couple of years a very sharp increase in international displacement. Nicaraguans, we have to remember, do not have a long history of high rates of migration to the US. Rather, they tended to go south towards Costa Rica. 400,000 a year, economic migration, that kind of circular shuttle migration. Two things happened to change this in the past couple of years. One is increased repression by the Daniel Ortega regime in Nicaragua, causing, I think, upwards of 150,000, maybe 200,000 Nicaraguans to opt to apply for political asylum in Costa Rica to try to stay permanently. The other thing that has happened is the economic and social effects of COVID within Costa Rica has, led to, more economic hardship, but also more xenophobia towards foreigners. And so I think that those two things together have shaped a pretty sharp increase in Nicaraguans also coming across. And I think that's part of a trend that we see, I think, across Latin America with COVID, and the ability of neighboring countries to absorb a lot of the displacement, I think has really changed since COVID. So there you have it.
Thank you. Terrific points. Adam, turning to you, one, is there anything that you would want to add about the root causes? And then just following on that, what are some of the levers that have been used or are being used to address these causes? And how do you see these levers having an impact in the short term?
Great question. And that was a great overview of the root causes. I would just add that you often, you'll see when you talk to migrants who from Central America at the border or elsewhere, you'll find that the same person has left for several reasons. It's a really mixed flow. More than once, I've had the conversation where somebody says, "Oh, I left because there's no employment and you just can't get a job and we're all poor." And then you'll talk for 5 minutes and then afterward they'll say, "Oh, and yeah, the gangs also killed my brother because he didn't pay his extortion, or the gangs were going to recruit my daughter and so we had to leave." But it's like you buried the lead. But in people's minds, it's just a bunch of things, right? So this, as Elizabeth said, we started the sort of search for solutions or search for policies that can address these root causes really got underway in 2014 after that first wave during the Obama administration of child and family migration that came from the Northern Triangle. And the Obama administration tried some things like helping Mexico crack down and make it harder to migrate, doing some initial things to put asylum out of reach. But the real brunt of it was a strategy of investment in Central America. Obama put Joe Biden, vice president, in charge of a strategy where they were seeking from Congress and got most of it, nearly $1 billion a year starting in 2015 in aid packages. Trying to get at several of these multiple flows or multiple reasons for people leaving. President Trump did not continue that. He did not ask for as much assistance. The aid went down. And of course, when migration numbers went up at the border, he got so angry at the Central American governments that he cut much of their aid. So this was not like a constant investment that was really dependable, unfortunately. But the design of this, which has been revived under the Biden administration, it's good in its goals. It's much more mixed with execution and design. Obviously, there's a recognition that poverty and inequality are a huge driver of this migration. But there's no real short-term fix for that unless you're going to do some sort of massive Marshall Plan. And there's not that. There's also a recognition that simply throwing money at this is not going to work, but there has been a lot of effort to try to get the private sector to invest in job creation. I think that Diego is going to talk about that a little bit. But there's also more of a recognition than there used to be that fighting poverty inequality means expanding democracy, expanding accountability. I mean, if a government has to be able to collect taxes and not have it stolen, punish any theft from the national budget. Rules have to apply clearly to all, which is crucial for an investment climate, but it's also crucial for fairness in society. So there's a huge rule of law component along with the social investment, a lot more emphasis on education for youth as well, creating opportunities for what they call the knee population, people between the ages of, say, 15 and 35 who do not go to school or have employment, which can be as much as a third of that population in many of these countries, which is a huge driver of why people enter gangs and also why people leave. So that's there have been programs seeking to address that with really mixed success. It's sort of inconstant. It's been very focused on cities and maybe not as much on the countryside, often not as much on marginal areas of cities. So it's helped the lower middle class, but maybe not the poorest. A big one, though, is a strategy that's been part of these aid packages to try to combat insecurity, public insecurity, the fact that people feel victimized by gangs and the rule of law is weak. People often cite gang violence as the reason that they're leaving. And it's frustrating because, you know, the United States and governments in the region have had some success defeating like leftist insurgencies, politically violent groups that wanted to take power in the country. You know, there's places in Colombia or El Salvador that were once dominated by guerrillas that are not now. You can drive from place to place, etc. There's very few places in Latin America that were once under organized crime or gang control that are now under organized gang or crime or gang control now. It's been much harder to weaken criminal groups, violent criminal groups, mainly because they prefer not to fight the government. That's bad for business. They'll rather be in populated areas, mixed in with the population, and often even fighting each other for control of a part of the government, like a municipal police force or something. So the trick to fighting organized crime or defeating gangs in the long term, not like the short-term stuff we're seeing in El Salvador right now, the long term is to break that link between organized crime and corrupt government officials who enable it and even profit from it, make examples of them in the justice system. And I think that it's not enough, but to some extent, the Obama and Biden administration's aid packages have sought to strengthen justice systems, strengthen the rule of law. There was a remarkable experiment in Guatemala in the 2010s to try to shore up the justice system and fight corruption. Justice system's also important for property rights. It's important for punishing human rights abuses. So many roads go through justice, and it has not gotten the attention that it requires when you're talking about this, but it's gotten more than it used to. But the United States can't fix this on its own. And if your recipient government in these areas is part of the problem, includes a lot of corrupt people, they're jailing reformers, et cetera, or becoming very authoritarian and populist, that limits what you can do too. So one of the main tools we've seen in the Biden administration has been efforts to try to support reformers either within institutions or on the outside, who may not be the leaders of those institutions, or who are NGOs or media outlets or whistleblowers, or parts of the judicial system, instead of just aiding the president. And that's tricky. It goes along with building up a security sector that can really protect people, a professional police force, judiciary, prisons, and not being led astray by corrupt or undemocratic leaders just because they do other things we like. Oh, you arrested some migrant smugglers. Oh, you seized a few tons of cocaine. Oh, you recognized Taiwan instead of China. We'll go easy on your corruption. That can be self-defeating. The most vexing part, I think, about the security strategy that we found so far is the short term. People want to feel safer now. They don't want to wait for the justice system to be fixed and the police to be reformed, which will take 5-10 years, right? They're unsafe now, and they're going to leave the country now. And really, people who are going for institutional reforms or the human rights community, we don't always have the best short-term solutions. How can I make you feel safer in 6 months? There are presidents who will say, well, gee, Nayib Bukele will say, well, I'll just lock up 1% of the population in 6 months, as he did. And yeah, crime rates will go down, but the life in the country changes, and that is not a long-term solution. That brings you to the other root cause of repressive governments, which are increasing in the region, especially Nicaragua, but we're seeing the advance of authoritarianism elsewhere. The United States shouldn't be doing regime change in these areas, but we should be doing a lot more multilateral diplomacy, targeted sanctions, supporting the opening of civic space in these countries, and certainly, again, not supporting repressive leaders just because they take pro-US stances once in a while. Gender-based violence, discrimination against Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ has been a greater focus of some of the US programs in the region, again, through supporting reformers or supporting specific units of the justice system, opening civic space for NGO advocates. It needs to be more of a priority than it has been, because people from particular social groups like these that I just mentioned will continue fleeing if there's not. And just touching on what Liz said about climate change, droughts and storms are the extent to which we've seen it so far, but they're nowhere near as severe as they're going to be. I think there's no really great answer yet. We know what we have to do to fix climate change. We're only beginning to do it. And meanwhile, I think you're going to see 20 or 30 years of increasing severity, especially in a really ecologically fragile region like Central America, of people leaving. So you're going to have to just prepare to accommodate climate migrants all over the region, including the United States. Try to foresee what the most likely mass human movements are going to look like. But again, no great answers there. So that's sort of what it's been so far, and it's been a very mixed picture.
Thank you. So long-term versus short-term, and are there short-term solutions? So, Diego, turning to you, in May 2021, the Biden administration announced its call to action, its Partnership for Central America, which has garnered 4.2 billion in private sector commitments to the Northern Triangle. So this is the investment that we were talking about earlier. So what impact do you think that the private sector could have, and what would local companies like to see to make those investments more effective?
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, so my background is mostly in the private sector. I co-founded Glasswing together with my two other co-founders, Selena and Ken. But in my experience and what we've been seeing here is that in Glasswing, and we try to blend it a bit, is that we, as the private sector, need to be consciously creating the conditions under which young people can flourish, right? And so there's a whole debate about the push migration and pull migration and all this sort of thing. But in the end, really, we kind of maintain that all things equal, people don't want to leave their community. They don't want to leave their family. A lot of the tough part is over the years, with the security threats, with all these things that Adam and Elizabeth have both mentioned, people get to a point of desperation where hope is not really an option. And so in the private sector, I think something we can do a whole lot more of, that's begun, but we can do a whole lot more of, is look to bring in succeeding generations. So, we know that the youth, that there's potential ingrained in everybody. But a lot of the time, for so many years, what's happened is, if I can't even imagine what I can do or what I'm capable of, because I've just never seen it, it's not within my, so I think both in the private and nonprofit sectors, I think it's really important to help to develop programs where we can help recalibrate young people's sense of what's possible here. And that recalibration has to do with, with building community, with building capacity, but it also has to do with providing access. And we can't have a situation where, I grew up many years in the US, and I used to hear about, you'll forgive me because I'm not politically inclined, and so I'm probably going to put my foot squarely in my mouth. But I heard, back in the day, about this whole notion of the haves and the have-nots, and when you talk about it, the problem is really serious when you have the haves and the can't-haves, I think. And so what happens if I have the sense that no matter what I do, I can't get ahead, I can't provide for my family and so on. So in the private sector, something I think that we've begun to do is bring people into the fold, not just capacity, but also provide access. And access means visibility, and it also means, when you have societies at large where the first few rungs of the ladder aren't there, we need to find a way to give access to the first rungs of the ladder wherever they are. And that, I think, would go a long way to allowing people to see themselves and imagine a future here with their families. And as Glasswing, we believe in people's rights, people's right to live a dignified life where they want to, and we do believe in asylum when it's warranted. But really, what we're trying to push as a private sector and in Glasswing in different ways, and maybe in different parts of the chain, are how can we help young people and the ninis that Adam referred to, that we work a lot with that sector, the ones that don't work or that don't currently work or study. How do we help them engranar? Sorry, I'm losing my English. How do we help them kind of connect with the productive sector, not just for profit? I mean, it could be anything. And I'll tell you, in Glasswing, for example, now we've been around since 2007, but I can tell you that over 10% of our workforce used to be what you would traditionally call beneficiaries, that are people that didn't see themselves having access, weren't really even able to project a future where they were owners of their destiny. And so now we've got almost 100 people within our organization working full-time, merit-based, right? I mean, this is not a handout in any sense of the word, you know, and so that's where we see potential. I think that the private sector, I think we need to do a little more active searching and active kind of going out, ir al encuentro, we say in Spanish, you know, going out to seek and bring together populations that have typically been on the margins of kind of, maybe we can call formal productive society, you know, whatever that means, you know, within the, but help the conditions through which young people can see themselves and have access to opportunities. So I do think that it's a little bit broad, and these are such enormous issues, but I do think on a very micro level, what I think the private sector, it behooves us to do is find ways of leveling the playing field. You know, a lot of young people now, and especially with the trends that Adam was mentioning before, there's a huge stigma, you know, so now if you're under 25 and you know, I mean, I have a tattoo, if you're under 25 and you got one of these, you know, it's tough. And so that, I think, in the private sector, there's a lot of room for internships, training, shadowing employers, and bringing more people into the fold. So I don't want to be too preachy, but I do think that it really behooves us as private sector to actively invest, not just in the labor pool we see that comes out of the traditional institutions, but broaden our reach a little bit and look to give access and to create conditions where talent and potential can flourish.
That's great. Thank you. And that's kind of a nice segue into my next question for you, Elizabeth, which is about vision, because I think Diego just articulated something, you know, a vision that the private sector can move forward on. But who is developing a vision in each of these countries in the region more broadly? And are there competing visions? And really, how do you see a vision taking hold?
Yeah, thank you. I think I might focus on Guatemala because of the extraordinary events that have been happening in Guatemala and the inauguration of its new president, Bernardo Arevalo. It's a hopeful moment. It's also a complex moment. So what has happened in Guatemala with the surprising election of Bernardo Arevalo is an urban middle-class alliance with indigenous authorities, communities, and movements, in a way that the motive force really, like, of the protests that have happened in Guatemala in defense of the integrity of the elections since last October, the motive force is really coming from the indigenous movements. And so this is a really important development in Guatemala because this alliance hasn't really been seen since the 1970s. And so there's a lot of energy in Guatemala right now about putting forward a new vision for a state that can try to get out from under its capture by organized crime, right? Which is a legacy of the counterinsurgency in Guatemala and deepened by the transnational drug trade and so on. So it's really important, and the indigenous communities have recognized the importance of the anti-corruption struggle because it impacts resources that they, would otherwise have for development. It also impacts things like political persecution against their leaders. So they have joined forces with Bernardo Arevalo, who of course is the son of Guatemala's former president, Juan Jose Arevalo, from 1944 spring. He is a diplomat in his career. He is an academic. He will govern as a moderate. So there are hopeful signs, but it's also very complex. So the indigenous communities, the autoridades ancestrales, as they're called, they've lined up behind Bernardo Arevalo. But they also want other things. They have a vision that partially coincides with maybe the urban middle class, but not totally. We see, for example, indigenous universities in Guatemala, also in Honduras, training young people, using elements of indigenous knowledge, thinking about land defense and the defense of resources. So the indigenous communities are also thinking about how can they gain greater control over the resources in their territory. And this has to do with things like extractive industries, like mining, like hydropower. So it's complicated, and there's a lot of contradictions, I think, between the central government and indigenous territories. But I think so much of the energy to defend democracy right now is coming from the indigenous communities. So what I would hope to see is, like, for example, in terms of the United States or in terms of international allies, to really look very seriously and very carefully at what the indigenous authorities and leaders are demanding. What are their demands? So they came out in defense of democracy, but what else are they asking for? So I think in terms of aid policies, to think about, how can the United States look at this moment and maybe try to do things somewhat differently, right? So in terms of the contradictions of our foreign aid, right? So maybe think about, not supporting so much extractive industry and really thinking about what the indigenous communities are asking for. And then finally, in terms of vision, I would echo a bit what Diego was saying. There are movements now across the region to think about both the right to migrate in a way that is not so punishing and not so full of human rights violations, as well as the right to stay in place. And I think the private sector could have a role in this kind of vision too. For example, a lot of people are talking about how to create a better, more equitable guest worker program so that people can come safely, work, but then with the goal of returning back to their communities. And I think the private sector has a big role, together with grassroots organization, to think creatively about something like that.
Yeah. Terrific point. I want to get in a couple more questions before moving to the Q&A, because I do see a lot of questions in the Q&A. Adam, turning to you, you have done extensive research into the military aspect of the relationship between the United States and Latin America. So how has U.S. policy, particularly the war on drugs and military aid and assistance, impacted the migration that we are seeing today? Because it seems like there's some complex, something happening with the right hand, something happening with the left hand in terms of governance and rule of law, but then also in terms of fighting crime.
Yeah, it's not determining, but it's certainly a factor. And it's one of the things that got me interested in this whole work that I do to begin with. I was growing up in New Jersey in the 1980s, and Central America was on the front page of the New York Times almost every day. It was on Tentacles Nightline almost every day, because the United States under Ronald Reagan was funding militaries in the region and funding insurgencies in the region, and really helping fight proxy wars. At this time, that was the height of the Cold War. And I, 13, 14, 15 years old, got really interested in why this was happening in a very nerdy way, I guess, but it was why I do this now. But yeah, I mean, you ask, why has necessary reform lagged so much in Central America, even more than in the rest of Latin America? The Northern Triangle plus Nicaragua remains the poorest part of the hemisphere, except for Haiti. It's one of the least equal places on the planet. Coming into the Cold War, I mean, you had very tiny elites, often related to coffee growing or U.S. fruit companies. They had militaries that were very closely tied to them, enormous levels of corruption, some of the lowest tax collection rates in the world. Actually, that remains the same. The indigenous and much of the poor majority completely excluded. But the United States wanted, going back to John F. Kennedy, wanted stability. They wanted stability for investments. They wanted to slow the advance of the Soviet Union. So they made common cause with people who really locked this system in place in Central America in an often brutal way, using their militaries and us heavily aiding their militaries. And for much of the Cold War, turning a blind eye to the human rights implications of that. Okay, those policies, except for Nicaragua, prevented leftist revolutions, prevented violent revolutions, but they also prevented peaceful reform. Anybody who questioned elite control or corruption was killed or forced into exile for decades. Democratic development was put off for a generation. There was very little investment in education, in women. Illiteracy remained high. family sizes remained high. There was a lost generation, and the United States was often on the wrong side, often measurably through its military aid programs, going up really through the end of the Cold War. Not as much during the drug war, where Central America was not a main theater of operations, but it did continue to be a pretext for continuing programs at a lower level. Now, the United States doesn't bear all the blame for this. I mean, this can easily be overstated. There's countries that didn't suffer a US-funded war, like Venezuela or Ecuador, that are sending a lot of migrants right now also. But definitely the United States put an enormous thumb on the scale in favor of corrupt elites and their militaries during the 20th century. Now, it's gotten better. The United States was a key support for the peace processes that ended those civil wars in Central America. But still, there's been squishy moments, like the Obama administration's really weak response to a military coup in Honduras in 2009. It would be interesting also, I think, to unpack the state of the region's elites now. I mean, I've just been bashing elites, but as you know, as Diego can tell you, it's much more complicated than that now. There's some dinosaurs and there's modernizers, and you know, it'd be interesting to know better whether the United States is more firmly on the side of the modernizing wing of those elites. Today's aid to Central America is mostly non-military. The United States, until Trump, was a key support for the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, which was really a model for fighting corruption and strengthening the justice system. But again, like I said before, it's been uneven, it's been inconsistent. Today's security aid to militaries and police is much lower than it used to be. It's mostly aimed at interdicting drugs or fighting migrant smuggling, not so much on citizen security, except for some model policing programs. There's been a reluctance to support things like what Bukele is doing in El Salvador, more, you know, very openly or financially. And there's a lot of wariness about working with corrupt security force units. Corruption's a much bigger concern than it used to be, because you end up, when you're fighting organized crime, you end up helping your enemies if you're helping corrupted units. So the focus really is only on working with militaries within the military, police within the police, who are people who are vetted and have their backgrounds checked, and you'll only work with that subunit and not the entire force. But still, I mean, even today, I think success is too much measured of U.S. policy. It's measured in cocaine interdicted, kingpins arrested or extradited, migrant smugglers arrested. And only to some extent is success being measured in reductions in crime rates or poll data saying people feel safer or that they don't want to leave as much as they used to, or confidence in democratic institutions. And some of that we're still really paying the cost of having needed reforms put on hold for a couple generations, with the United States often on the side.
That's a great point about the measures of success and maybe re-examining them. One final question, and then I'll turn to the Q&A box. Diego, one thing that I'm particularly interested in general is demographics and how youth population and aging populations are impacting the dynamics around the world. Youth population is obviously a very big factor in the work that you do. So I'd love to just hear a little bit from you about what your program team is hearing from young people in the countries that you work in, and what are they most concerned about, and what gives them hope, and you know, particularly on the private sector side.
Sure. So what we hear, so there's this, again, I'm not terribly technically adept with all this stuff and jargon and so on, but I will tell you that what we fight the most, I think, you know, the worst phrase I know, I lived in the US for 20 years, you know, and we left because of violence back then in the 70s. So I dating myself a little bit. And one of the most striking things for me when I came home, I had always heard the phrase, but is ni modo. I don't know if you've heard the phrase before, but ni modo basically is equivalent to this gesture. And that means there's nothing to be done. And just with this gesture, you know, with one hand, you throw out your agency, and with the other hand, you throw out your hope, you know, and then nothing happens. And I think that if you get more technical, so my co-founder, Selina, she's the one that teaches me about these things. You know, she says, you know, that's called learned helplessness. So, you know, from generations of, you know what, there's nothing I can do about it. So they're waiting for someone to come and fix. And it's not because they're being lax or because they're being late. It's just, you know, I can't imagine how I could have anything to do with the solution here. And I think we see some of that. We see some of this kind of nimo, like, what am I supposed to do? And so we work a lot in helping youth discover their agency, and so then within that, help discover agency, and then provide a context in which that agency can be put to use, and they can develop resilience, kind of community-based resilience too, so that you can feel accompanied, you're shoulder to shoulder with people who also want something better. And of course, if you whittle down, and I think everybody on this call knows far better than I, if you whittle it down, what we really want is to have a good existence, and be able to, do as much as we can, and love and live and so on. And I don't mean to be cheesy, but that really, that's at the very core, that's what we're looking for. And so I think that the youth, something that we see is this, but then when they get into these programs, when we do anything from Central America Service Corps to the employment programs, even our work inside the public school systems we work in 14 countries, in not just the Northern Triangle, but in Dominican Republic, or in Colombia, or in Mexico, and we actually have a few schools where we work after school programs in New York City. And what we find is that it doesn't take a whole lot, it's kind of, there's nothing a kid can do when they have a caring adult that brings to them something they wouldn't ordinarily have access to. And a lot of the time, that's just visibility. It's just like, oh, so that can happen? Like, if I do that, is that actually possible? So again, I go back to this, the idea of recalibrating our sense of what can be done and what I can do. So one thing is this, and then the other one that kind of reinforces the ni modo that we hear a lot is the stigma. Is that, it's incredible because we talk about the potential of young people, and the irony is that we all go through our lives and we all have potential. We all have potential for good and for bad. Unfortunately, a lot of people have developed kind of an intrinsic fear of young people because of the whole gang phenomenon, because of and this is the whole region. So it's almost like, and at the same time, as Adam's saying, I've worked a lot with the U.S. Embassy over the years with different ambassadors, and I've seen a lot with AID. We work a whole lot, and a lot of these things are large scale. They move the needle, but it does take a while. And it's not if I'm a young person in a community that one way or the other, I was speaking to one of the people we worked with, one of the a young woman that is now one of our team members. And she was saying, what, our communities teach us that there's no way out. And so we hear that a lot, the community kind of says, what, you can't, forget it, ni modo, and so all it takes is kind of injecting somebody in there that kind of bridges your sense of what expectations you can be entitled to. Yes, you get to dream. Yes, you get to have hope, but it's not easy or natural. So we hear a lot from people, from the young people, is this stigma. They feel it holds them down, and at the same time, another thing that's actually quite encouraging is that what do these human beings want, right? I mean, it's just like any of us, and they want to support their families. They feel like they have adversity. They want to support their families. They want to be a productive member of their community. They want a dignified life, and they feel these things are holding them back. Now, when they get their sense of agency, when they start developing, we have a lot of after-school clubs, and I don't remember what I was watching on some Netflix thing the other day, and they were saying, well, what they were talking about, this club that was great. It provides a sense of belonging. It provides a sense of kind of a vision. It provides security in a certain sense, and so on. So you could say the same thing about organized crime organizations, and so when you provide this other alternative, which is constructive, they're in something as simple as a song and dance club where you have to be vulnerable because nobody feels entirely comfortable jumping around and dancing and singing in front of other people, especially men in a stereotypical sense in Central America, right? And you see these young boys and they're rocking it, and they're starting to feel comfortable, and so they start developing these pods of that eventually turn into resilience. So what we hear is, we do hear about the stigma, but we also hear on the other side, as soon as each young person is standing on their own 2 feet, they're not just thinking about themselves. immediately they're thinking about how they can help the community. And immediately, I mean, not only do we have 80 some odd people working in the different Glasswing offices that have been at one point or another, I don't know what the better word is, but people we've worked with, I mean, they're beneficiaries one way or the other. But in addition to that, we've got a whole lot of volunteers that what they're doing is, hey, somebody came here and showed me that there's life on the other side of that street. I want to go do the same because now I'm in college. And I can't help but go back to the anecdotes, because when we look at the big numbers, I don't know, it just seems a little abstract, you know, but in a very real sense, on the one hand, the stories we hear worry us, and on the other, the stories we see being created before us, because we can't take credit for these kids blossoming. I mean, they do it. We just try to find a way to provide better conditions so that they can actually find that. And I think that when that happens, what we hear from them is, how can I give back? And that turns out to be super cool. You know, I mean, it's a huge source of inspiration and a lot of what we learn, you know, and they become kind of champions and advocates, and they become kind of team members with us in one way or the other. So I think those are the things that we hear and that we witness as we go, you know, kind of live alongside of a you know, good number, you know, many tens of thousands of youth that we work with every week.
That's wonderful. Thank you. It sounds like really amazing work that you're doing. I want to get to the Q&A box. So we have a bunch of questions coming in. I apologize, I will not be able to get to all of them, but Elizabeth, I'll direct this first one to you. And of course, you know, feel free to chime in, Adam, Diego, if you'd like. So the one I want to take first is about Venezuela, actually. So migration from Venezuela has substantially increased recently. Is it the same or different in character compared to migration from the Northern Triangle?
I would say there's a lot of differences. One is, again, that I was saying, the history of transnationalism among Central American migrants mean that most everyone, say, coming from El Salvador, Guatemala, even in some sense Honduras, has already family to go to, right? Family members of their community. They might even have a job lined up, right? Because they've been recruited by their cousin who works in X industry. For Venezuelans, I think it's a little bit different. I think perhaps there was a first group of Venezuelans who were coming maybe a couple of years ago, maybe somewhat more affluent, maybe already had relatives in the United States. But then we saw people coming from Venezuela that were much less affluent, or, you know, quite impoverished, that had really, you know, not flown to Mexico and crossed the border, but had been through the Darien Gap. Maybe they had been, you know, in other Latin American countries before that, and maybe didn't have anybody, right? Don't even have sponsors, reliable sponsors who are going to agree to house them and help them, right? And so that's a really different scenario, particularly for the receiving communities in the, I don't have to tell you, right? And that's not really what we see with the Central Americans, right? Who generally have all these networks that are pretty deeply established. So I think that's one of the main differences that I've seen.
All right, wonderful, thank you. Adam, just turning to you, we have a question about what are some concrete ways that the United States and Mexico can collaborate to better manage migration from the Northern Triangle to and across the southern border?
I mean, there's two ways to answer this. One would be if you actually had the power or the ability to change laws, which rarely happens in the U.S. system right now. But if you could, comprehensive immigration reform here, opening more legal pathways, opening more labor opportunities, and, you know, helping Mexico do more also to integrate migrants in its system. If you're working under current conditions in which asylum, standing on a country's soil and saying, don't send me back because my life will be in danger, and then getting due process to do that, that is how most people are finding a way, for now at least, to be in the United States or Mexico. If that is our one choice, then we need to invest here in the United States way more in rapid processing. rapid with due processing of asylum seekers so that, people can go to a port of entry and do this in an orderly way, be in an alternative to detention program where they're monitored, but they're able to actually live and make money here in the United States while they await their court date, which hopefully isn't years away anymore because we would have enough judges to hear it. We're far from that right now, but most of that would not, none of that would require a change to existing law. It would require changes to budget appropriations. And Mexico's asylum system as well has expanded a lot in recent years. They took 140,000 applications, roughly half of them from Central America last year, which, 10 years ago, it was about 2,000. So they have vastly expanded. But Mexico is also a country of 130 million people with a $1 trillion economy. There are states in the industrial areas in the north, in the Bajío and elsewhere that are employers say they're desperate for workers, and they could actually absorb more migrants than they have been. As a percentage of the population, Mexico, it's never really been a migrant receiving country, but it's way lower than the foreign-born population currently in Costa Rica or the Dominican Republic or Colombia or elsewhere. I'll just add one note on the Venezuelan population in the United States. There's about 1 million Venezuelans who have come in the last 20 years to the United States. There's another 6.5 million who have settled elsewhere in Latin America, mostly since about 2015. This is not just at all a US-bound population. Many of them would rather stay closer to home or be in a Spanish-speaking country.
Yeah, great context there. Diego, I'm actually getting a couple of questions here about when it comes to investment from the United States and industries that are ripe for investment in general. What are some specific sectors that really have the potential to entice the population to stay, to be able to make those connections that you've been talking about earlier, and kind of really bolster at least on the economic front?
I mean, looking at the Northern Triangle, let's say that's what we've been talking about. We've traditionally had a lot of back then agriculturally based. There's still some agriculture, but yesterday I was sitting with people from government here, and they were saying, we import 80% of our food in El Salvador, and you say, that's not great. And but the thing becomes, how can we bolster an economy that adds more value and therefore can provide more value in terms of the labor market and employment and so on? Because we've been moving somewhat, and you see, for example, nearshoring is something that's a very interesting phenomenon now, because since there are let's say I don't know what the right word is, but anyway, the relationship with the Far East and China in particular, let's say, has been changing. That's also kind of directing a lot of attention on the economic front south. I do think that should bring us some potential where we can start kind of going up, and also the level of employment in the US, is still very, very high. And so that does provide for some interesting, in one of our businesses, that it's called You Assist Me. And You Assist Me is a company where it's still small. It's about 400 people, but we are basically doing remote work for small to medium-sized companies in the US. And so what happens is, hey, look at that. That's an interesting way of curtailing. It's a cool way of redistributing opportunity without migration, right? Because you're working, it's kind of like you can pursue the fabled American dream without doing this tremendously dangerous and risky, taking on this voyage and staying with your family. And so I do think, for example, the whole BPO industry has been growing quite a bit. And there's some interesting things that you have to navigate, because for some time, the US was not very keen on like widespread English programs, because then the question is, if a lot of people speak English, will they start migrating? So there's, and I don't think it's black and white, right? But we tend to think that no, if people want to stay with their families, by and large, if if there's not a huge push like violence, and so I do think there are quite a few industries that there's manufacturing as well, but it's so higher order manufacturing and service exports. I think, and we're a region naturally prone to logistics because of our, where we are, and kind of bi-coastal in most cases, not El Salvador or Belize, but everybody else. I do think that the U.S. can have a huge impact in terms of where the U.S. is sourcing certain things that maybe they were sourcing in other places. And I do think also, and this is something, a long conversation we've had with a lot of different people, ambassadors and other people in the U.S. Embassy, and it's how can the U.S. embassies, as proxies, find ways of connecting at various, not, because there's a lot of times that we go with the private sector. Let's go meet with the private sector, and it's the same people show up, right? And, oh, there's the private sector people, or let's go show up with the NGO people. Okay, the same people. I'm the only clown that goes back and forth every once in a while. But I think that it's important to find in the U.S. system a way to go a little more grassroots. And understand, like Elizabeth was saying, for example, in Guatemala, and I can't say it's not being done. I just think that there's opportunity to really broaden kind of the reach, and therefore, legitimacy in our neck of the woods is scarce these days. Not a whole lot of people have it, and so I think that human connections and long tentacles will go a long way. I think hating people from far away is easy. Once you actually lock eyes and you realize that they're a lot more similar than you are than you think. I do think that in addition to kind of program investment and bringing, say, factories and contact centers, this, that, the other, that I think we can do. I also think that the degree of influence and connection would be very cool to be able to spread it on a more grassroots level.
Great. Great thoughts. And just a quick final lightning round, just because we have a couple minutes left. This is a big year of transitions, at least in the United States. I'd love to just hear from each of you very briefly, like if you could do like 30 seconds, if at all possible. What are you most worried about seeing? Like what would be like, we're going in the wrong direction, and what would be something that you're like, we're headed in the right direction? This would be a positive policy change, at least in the United States. Adam, I'll start with you.
One thing that really worries me right now is that there may be a bipartisan push to limit access to asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, particularly for Central Americans who are coming here at a time where we're seeing an increase in families coming and asking for protection. How severe that limitation will be will depend really on whether the Democratic Party or the Republican Party wins, but both seem to be headed in that direction. Something positive that could happen in this 2024 election year. Well, I would say, I guess I would have to point to something like the Biden administration was surprisingly forceful in its support of President Arebelo's election. And with 3 days after leaving office, his predecessor, Mr. Giammattei, had his U.S. visa revoked because of all of the corruption allegations swirling around him. That's the right message, and that's the right way to go. And I hope to see more of that.
Great. Thank you. Elizabeth?
I agree absolutely with what Adam said. Yes, eyes on Guatemala. It is a hopeful moment in Guatemala. Speaking as someone who lives and works here on the border, I have a lot of trepidation about what's likely to come in terms of limiting the asylum system, in terms of ratcheting up punishment against people as a deterrent. I mean, we've seen it doesn't work. It just changes. It makes migration riskier, more dangerous. It doesn't deter it. So I have a lot of fear about that. And just in general, the border becoming our sacrificial zone because we can't resolve the contradictions of our politics.
Great point. Lastly, but not least, Diego.
Thanks. So what's gotten me excited these days, and I think that it could be, and this is kind of on the margin of the political issue, which is a very different discussion, but we're seeing in Guatemala, in El Salvador and Guatemala now with this new possibility, let's say, Honduras a little bit different, but we are seeing a lot of people that have traditionally been in the U.S. for years and years starting to look down and starting to look south to actually move home. Someone asked me last night, why did you move home after 20 years? And I said, I never doubted it. I mean, it was in my family. It was like we were always going to go home at some point. And I do think that I see a huge potential in migrating, the reverse migration. I see huge potential because that brings not only capital but also all sorts of benefits. So that's something that in Guatemala, El Salvador, and hopefully Honduras, but that's something that would make me, very optimistic about our future country. What I would be concerned about is that I guess the government collaboration specifically, I just see a lot of volatility. So I find it difficult and ironic because we both want the same thing. We always say that, we sit with the embassy and we want to curtail irregular migration. Okay, I mean, we're happy that people stay and want to make their lives here. So we want the same thing. So it's a little frustrating to see how we get tripped up a little bit. And I think that I would really love to see more frank collaboration and more pragmatic collaboration as opposed to, a lot of words.
Great. Well, things to look for in this very interesting year. Thank you all. This was a fascinating conversation, and I think just underscores the complexity of the topic and that it's not as easy as we like to think it is. So with that, thank you. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. Our next discussion, so the next one in the mini series is February 1st. It should be, I think, really fascinating just to dig into how New York is dealing with this and looking at it in a larger historical context, which I think is really important. And then we do have another briefing coming up before then we have an in-person event on Monday, January 22nd for those who are in New York. We're looking at the Israel-Hamas war through international humanitarian law. And our next virtual event is on the 23rd of January, and it's on innovation in US-China and the innovation landscape. So I hope you can all join us for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, especially to our panelists. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day, everyone.